But good morning. You know how it sometimes feels that, what now? What next? What are we going to do now? Yeah, this maybe happens to you and me. Maybe if we have some kind of event or gathering or something we prepared for. Maybe it's the kids coming for Christmas time or some Thanksgiving or something. And it goes on, it's just fine, it's just wonderful, and everybody's happy, and they go home, and then you say, well, now what are we going to do? You ever had that? That's really the situation that we find ourselves in, as was mentioned at the top of the service. Last week was Easter. Now what are we going to do? You know how we prepared for all of that? How we worked up to Easter? How we got all excited about it? How we studied all those things? If you're like me, it just forced you back into the Bible, looking at things, reading the story. We find another study to look at that prepares us for the lessons of the Passover and the Monday, Thursday, or Good Friday, or whatever you want to call that stuff. And then Easter came and we celebrated and we enjoyed it. And now a week later, now what do we do? I contend that and want to present to you that I think the answer to that is in the scripture Jay just read, Psalm 16. You might not think that initially, but I want to kind of explore that today. Good morning, I'm Fred Stevens. As Tony mentioned, we've known each other, since the previous century. A few of us were talking before church, and I was kind of impressed. Everybody had similar kind of dates to me, that late 60s, early 70s kind of period of time. It was a big deal in our denomination, whatever. Others of you might have come in since, and so I met you along the way, like Brad when he came to college and stuff like that. Other people I maybe met at SCP along the way, and so I never thought I'd help out at SCP, but my son got old enough to go, and my wife said he's not able to go by himself. So she stayed home with the younger one, and off I went. I thought, I don't know how to do this. And I don't know, 13 years later or something, we were still there. The boys had come and gone, and we were still there. And I learned so much from SCP. And I was so glad to be involved. I came in, as Tony said, to the college in 1970. I didn't have any background in the church. I had never attended. I had never met anybody, didn't know anything about it, and so forth. And, this was overwhelming. I didn't even unpack for a full semester. I was ready to leave. This was so strange. What a crazy bunch of holy rollers I was among, I thought. But, then I learned something. All these other people, they all had the same story. They all told the same things. And I realized they really believe it. They're all very sincere. I don't really need to fear them individually. But I need to find out if they've been duped. So I prayed about it. Boy, does that ever cause problems, right? You pray about something and God answers your prayer. Oh dear. So I came in 1970 to Ambassador in Pasadena, and I'm kind of still there. I mean, the college is left. The church headquarters is left. I'm still there. So interesting. And over all those years, I had so many wonderful, interesting experiences. And when it came to finding out if they had been duped or whatever, I thought, well, I need to meet this guy who's in charge, this Herbert Armstrong guy. So when he got back to campus after opening the others, he gave a Bible study, and I said, everybody else got to shake his hand, but I didn't get here till the last minute. I'm going to shake his hand. And after Bible study, I went down there in the front aisle, and I stood right there, and I said, he's not getting to the car without shaking my hand. I had to find out if that was a genuine handshake. It was. And God blessed me in various ways after that, and over my time in college, and then afterwards, and there was, there's always some kind of thing going on. And he was doing formal dinners for the seniors, and I got to be part of going over there as a senior. And then after I graduated, they needed help with those dinners, and the housekeeper knew me because I had helped arrange things the previous year. And the next thing you know, I was the butler. Now, how many people can say, I once worked as a butler? And there were lots of very grand guests at those meals with him, including all those students who came through. Very, very special, wonderful people planted all over the world yet today. There were other great guests and interesting people to meet, and I got to be there as a guest at dinner when his guest was Jahan Sadat, the widow of Anwar Sadat, the former president of Egypt, and got to meet and chat with her. Later on, I even butlered a little bit for Joe Tkach when he was in that role in that same house, and there I met the most important celebrity of all. People are always impressed when I say, I served dinner to Trader Joe. Joe Colomb himself came to dinner, and I got to serve that. He was a very interesting, very down-to-earth, very fine fellow. All that was interesting experiences. But you know what that really was? Is God answering my prayer. Is this sincere? Are these people genuine? Where's their heart in it? And you can say all kinds of things, and I can say all kinds of things about Herbert Armstrong and his teachings and all those things, and yes, 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 yes. But it's not about Herbert Armstrong. It's not about any of the other people who are leading. It's about what God was doing, and what was God doing in their lives. You know, there was one time Herbert Armstrong was kind of mulling after dinner and saying, well, they say this and they say that and they say the other about me, and he was kind of, as we all do, kind of getting down on himself. And he says, but they don't realize that Christ can discipline me. Trying to pick up the mood, I said, what you're saying is you just work here. It was a little risky to say that, but I said it. And he looked at me for a long time and he said, yeah, I just work here. But that's a good lesson. We're all just working here. We're all just here because God brought us here and is doing something with us and doing something greater than what it appears at the time. Over the years, it was kind of neat to meet Joe Tkach. And even as a freshman in college, it was, I guess, kind of neat to be the freshman closest to the back door. So when that sophomore, Joe Tkach Jr., came over to visit his friends, I had to be the one to get up and let him in. So I've kind of known them for a long time. And his wife, Tammy, came and worked for us in the accounting department, which is where I met Mom. And Tammy worked there, and one day I got a call from this Joe Tkach Jr. over in Phoenix, and he said, Fred, he says, I need your help. I kind of would like to get together with Tammy, and she works there for you, and she's coming over to Phoenix, and I really want to spend some special time. He says, could you let her have Friday off? And he teased later that in order to have his first hot date with Tammy, he has to get my permission. We laugh about that. So I've been around, since Hector was a pup, and he's a full-grown dog now. But there were lots of people around when I first came who were like that too. They'd been around a long, long time before me. Not that there's anybody here on the front row like that. Friend of mine invited a few of us up he says, I have these great friends, the Smiths. We had to go up and visit them, and we came up to Los Olivos and stayed the weekend and had such a wonderful time, and Beverly and I were talking about how much fun that was. I just loved her house. There was food within reach everywhere. Right? You sit on the sofa, and right over here there was some grapes. You'd walk over here and there's some fresh beans. And then and the trash can was in the middle of the kitchen. As Carlton said, where it should be, so you could stand and eat right over it. I love that. And she said to me when we came in, I said, I remember coming to your house, and she said, oh yeah, young men like to eat. And eating is also a part of something that's important that connects us and brings us together and so forth. I will mention one other thing about that trip. I came up to meet, I don't know if any of you were here at that time. This Northern Church was meeting in Arroyo Grande at the time. I don't know if any of you were part of that. Well, and Mr. Smith said, all right, you guys come with me, and we'll go up to Arroyo Grande. And then we went out to get in the car, and he says, I need to work on my sermon, so Fred, you drive. I'll never forget that car. That was like a bucking bronco. Had this 4-on-the-floor shift with the silver hand. You had to be in charge if you were going to drive that car. And I learned a few things on that trip, and I felt a little better at the end of it. I hadn't ground more than a pound of gear away. by the end. It sure was a wonderful time, and I thank you again for that, hosting that beautiful experience in my lifetime. That connected me a little bit with all of you up here in a certain sense. I had other connections over the years. One was when I did go to, remember I had to go to SEP because my son was old enough, and then they made me a dorm, what was I? A counselor, dorm counselor. Oh, yeah. And then this exuberant kid came in named Lomboy, Rodmer. And he was in my dorm that first year. That was so fun. To make all these connections with people. And you know what? Our whole church history was about connections with people. And I used to say this, Facebook wasn't created until after our church kind of split up into different groups. Before that, we were Facebook. You could go anywhere in the world, and you could find somebody there who would put you up. You could take any photograph of a group. I did this. We went to the feast in Thailand several years, and we took group photos. And we said, you could take this group photo to any congregation of the church worldwide, and people in that congregation would know somebody in it. Wow, what a thing. What a thing to be connected. This is where God is going, right? And even if you've come around since and you don't know where you're at and this and that and the other, I just want to provide this encouragement that, boy, God is up to something. And he's up to something individual within you. And it's not about the other person. It's not about the leadership. It's not about the other people. It's not even about doctrine. It's about a relationship with Jesus Christ. And it's about your personal experience. I remember telling my sons as they went to college, people are going to challenge you into, as far as your thinking and your religious training and background and so forth. But fine, you could get into all kinds of arguments about all of that. Does God exist? And what about evolution? And blah, 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 blah. And all that's kind of interesting, actually kind of good to look at and turn that over. But nobody can tell you your personal experience. Nobody can argue with your relationship, your answered prayers, your times with God. That's your foundation. That's what you have. That's what's important. So with that off the topic background, let's come back to this question here that I thought would be a nice provocative title. Who's still passionate? This is not a marriage sermon. Well, yes it is, but in another way. It's a marriage sermon in the sense of somebody else's marriage, not necessarily you and me. There's some really important individuals in the world, the most important of which is the one we're here to celebrate. The most important man who ever lived, who lived and died and rose again. When we come back after Easter and we say, what next? It's so interesting to look at this Psalm 16. As Dave read through it, you probably got near the end and you recognized a couple phrases that related to Jesus. Like, what's that one about not seeing my corruption in the grave? Not confining me to the pit, as some translations call it. Oh yeah, we can see that applied to Jesus, right? And it didn't apply to David, who wrote this psalm. That's interesting. Is this psalm about King David, or is it about the Messiah? Or is the answer yes to both? That's some of the things we want to consider here and see what's being said. This psalm is called a miktam. Some of your Bibles will say in here, a miktam of David. There's only 6 psalms that are called a miktam. And nobody really knows what miktam means. They think it's a Babylonian term or a Syrian term before then that might mean a covering, or it might mean gold. They don't really know. But there's only 6 of them that have this title, a miktam. You know what I think that kind of means? A gold star. Just kind of, the ancients who put this together put a little star next to this one. It's kind of like favoriting something on your phone. These 6 are kind of special. And this Psalm 16 is kind of special. Notice some of the phraseology here. Protect me, O God, for in you I take refuge. This is David. This is David's experience. This is David's devotion. This is Jesus in his relationship with the Father. O God, for in you I take refuge. Think about what he went through in the week just before what we celebrated on Easter. Where did he take refuge? Where did he put his trust? How did he get through all of that? In you I take refuge. You are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. And Jesus said he and the Father were one. He was nothing apart from the Father. He gave all praise and honor to the Father. He was connected completely with the Father. David wrote, as the holy ones in the land, they are the noble in whom is all my delight. Is that just David talking? No, these are all the people in the land here that were now under David's rule, that God had brought there through amazing deliverance and 450 years of all kinds of experience, in whom God delighted. And Jesus delighted in God's children and everybody else. And he expressed that unending love. Probably in preparing for the Passover and so forth, you read that scripture where Jesus, it says in John that Jesus loved the disciples. He loved them to the end. Wow. That's a very significant phrase. He loved them to the end. He always loved them. He even said, here's these Roman soldiers nailing him to the cross, and he said, forgive them, Father, they don't know what they're doing. He loved them. Wow. You know, here's women and so forth along the way worrying about him. He's not even strong enough to carry the cross, and he said, don't worry about me. Think about what's really important. And there's so many lessons we can find in story after story there in that week, in those days just before Easter. And what do we call that? Passion Week. This is the week and these are the hours of Christ's passion. Okay? Psalm 16, the Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. Remember Jesus saying, Father, take this cup. But his real choice is, Father, your cup is my portion. I'll take this cup. It is amazing to think about what he did as a man, as God. It's amazing that a man would volunteer to go through that stuff or endure all that stuff that he endured. It's even more amazing to think that God would do that. That he would bring himself there and subject himself to the cruelty of a humankind that was off the track, of a people and so forth that had broken away from the guidance they'd been given, of people who thought they loved and don't love, of people who were politically motivated, like the leaders of the Jews at that time. They were trying to keep their power. They were trying to keep peace with the Romans. They were trying to survive this. And why did the Romans do what they did and then, end up crucifying Christ? They were trying to keep control of these Jews. It's interesting the motives that were going on there. They're not any different today. We're all humans, broken in all these same ways, suffering through these things. And God was willing to let himself be subject to that and go through that. Why? I think it says here something about he loved his people. He loves his people. He loved them to the end. The psalm says, I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. Jesus' example of seeking the Father in the night and all the time is amazing. What did he do the night before out in that garden but seek the Father and pour his heart out and pour his blood out? Wow. That's how he survived, and he did that. And he was passionately involved in doing what he was doing. I keep the Lord always before me because he is at my right hand, and I shall not be moved. Whoa! Is that David? Yeah, for a while. But David was a human. And he said some nice things and set some good examples, and he messed up too. Okay? It's interesting. God chose David. He said, here's a man with a heart that I can work with. And what did he work with him to do? He worked with him to write down some of these amazing praises that we are still singing in church, that we are paraphrasing in modern songs. David has had a huge influence on the whole world. But David was just a tool in God's hands. And in one of the ways he was a tool is God said that my Messiah, the Messiah, will come through him. And there's to be David's descendant that would have David's throne and live on forward. And here we are celebrating and focusing on that descendant, that son of David, the Messiah, Jesus. He says, I keep the Lord always before me because he is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. Therefore my heart is glad and my soul rejoices. My body also rests secure. My heart is glad and rejoicing. I don't think that evening there going into Gethsemane and all that sounded very fun or rejoicing. Quite the opposite. And yet what I read through this is that's where Jesus was inside himself. On the inside, in his heart, he was rejoicing. He was suffering on the outside, but he was doing all this for a reason, because of his incredible, unending devotion. Okay? And he had that unending devotion because he was connected with the Father, and it's the Father's devotion. And I'm having technical difficulties, but anyway, beyond that. He says, my body also rests secure. Really? His body that suffered, died, resting secure? For you do not give me up to Sheol, or the grave, or let your faithful one see the pit, or corruption. Now that's interesting. Because he didn't. Well, 3 days? Well, whatever. He walked out of there anyway. Right? No one else has done that. Now, Jesus did that to some other people, like Lazarus and a few others. It had happened other times in history through special intervention of God. There was a man they went to bury in the tomb of Elijah, was it? And when his body touched Elijah's bones, he came back to life. This is quite a statement. You know what? God was right. In the day you eat of that, he told Adam and Eve, you'll die. In other words, he was in charge of death from the beginning. And he's always been in charge of death. And he's still in charge of death. And we have no control over that. We can control so many other things, but not that. And that's what's really scary to us. But he can control that. Okay? And he says, my body rests secure. You show me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. In your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Wow. Wow. This is the attitude of Jesus. After Easter, then what? We get an opportunity to stop and reflect on the attitude of Jesus. That's where we are today. Reflecting on what this meant. Now, as was appropriately mentioned in the video at the beginning, the disciples were rather confused by all this, right? This was rather topsy-turvy and who knows what to think, and oh my, this was stressful. You think being in this church is stressful. What they went through was stressful, right? We learned from all of this. You know, some of these things that we read about here in this psalm and that we comment on were also commented on by some of the first believers in that first century church. Let me just refer to a couple of them, and I'll read a couple statements to you. The one is from the Apostle Paul. Now, Paul, this is a little while later, and he'd had a bunch of experiences. This is several years after Jesus' resurrection. And Paul and Barnabas are out on this trip, whatever, this first time they go somewhere, and they're in Antioch in Pisidia, wherever that is. That's, it's in the Bay Area or somewhere. I don't know. Right? And they went to the synagogue and sat down, and they read the law and the prophets. This is what they always did in that church, right? They read the law and the prophets. And then they asked them, so if you brothers, if you have anything to say, if you have any message from God, share it with us. And Paul said, listen, what I learned recently is in that Jewish culture, the word listen has a lot of impact. There's a lot of impact. Listen doesn't just mean hear it. Listen means respond to it. Listen means do it. Listen means put your heart into it. He says, listen, the God of this people, Israel, chose our fathers and made the people great during their stay in Egypt. Now, wow, he is just jumping way back in history and talking about what went on in Egypt and how this little group of 12 brothers and all that family grew into this big bunch, right? And then God brought them out of Egypt. And Paul goes on, and for about 40 years, he put up with them in the wilderness. Well, that's a way of describing that. You go back and read that history. Okay? And after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he gave them their land as an inheritance. And all this took about 450 years. I'm quoting Paul. Okay? So he's telling people, it's a background. He's bringing them, they're all Jews. He's reminding them of their whole story and where they are. He says, they asked for a king and God gave them Saul for about 40 years. And when he'd finally removed him, he gave them David. Okay? Brothers, sons of the family of Abraham, those are Jews, and those among you who fear God, those are the Gentile converts that were there in the synagogue with them. In other words, all these people. Okay? For those who live in Jerusalem and their rulers, Pharisees back there, that council, who, because they did not recognize him or understand the utterances of the prophets, which are read every Sabbath, those guys fulfilled those prophecies by condemning Jesus. Interesting reflection on history and bringing them up to what was happening right then in their time. That they didn't learn the lesson of history and they fulfilled the prophecy and condemned Jesus. And though they found no guilt in him, they took him down, they had him crucified. But God raised him from the dead. And there are those coming with him from Galilee who are now witnesses to the people of the fact that God raised him from the dead, no more to return to corruption. There's a reference back here to what we were seeing in Psalm 16. Okay? He says, and as for the fact that he raised him, it is spoken in this way, I will give you the holy and sure blessings of David. He says in another psalm, you will not let your Holy One see corruption. Well, that's Psalm 16. For David, after he'd served the purpose of God, fell asleep, was laid with his fathers, and saw corruption. But he whom God raised up did not see corruption. This is Jesus. This is what happened on Easter. Okay? God raised him up. And through him, forgiveness is proclaimed, and by him, everyone who believes is freed from everything from which you could not be freed by the law of Moses. Significant statement to be saying to Jews. You could not be freed by the law of Moses. And this God, this Jesus, has freed you from all that those things couldn't free you from. Wow. And after he'd finished this sermon, Paul and Barnabas went out, and the people begged that these things might be told to them again. And the next Sabbath, almost the whole city gathered. And in that following sermon, Paul made a mention that this was now going out to all the Gentiles. And it specifically says, and when the Gentiles heard this, they began rejoicing and glorifying the word of the Lord. And then it says, but the Jewish leaders had a little trouble accepting this change. And they were jealous. And they asked Paul and Barnabas to get out of town. And they went on somewhere else. Now that's a whole interesting history. Why were these people not able to accept this new understanding? Why were they not able to see what was coming and to recognize Jesus when he arrived? The prophets say it had something to do with their heart. A heart of stone, as it's called. Right? But what had Jesus now brought and is bringing? And it gets again celebrated about 6 weeks from now when we celebrate what? Pentecost. What happens next? A softening of the heart, a heart of flesh, the heart of God, the heart that's revealed in this passionate life of Jesus. There was another place where some of this Psalm 16 is referred to, and that's in Acts 2, when Peter first got up to talk. Peter! Now just think about this guy. Pretty impetuous, pretty outspoken, pretty strong, pretty fun person, sort of. Right? Somebody you'd all like to know, but then again, he's Peter. Right? Interesting, strong personality. Okay? And Peter was there with all of them in Acts 2, and it says, Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them. Okay? And he talks to them about Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with deeds of power, wonders, and signs. And he talks about how he was crucified and killed. And Peter says, but God raised him up, freed him from death, because it was impossible for him to be held in its power. Quoting Peter, for David says concerning him, I saw the Lord always before me, for he is at my right hand, and I won't be shaken. Therefore my heart was glad, and my tongue rejoiced. Moreover, my flesh will live in hope. For you will not abandon my soul to Hades, or let your Holy One experience corruption. Psalm 16. Peter refers to it right there. Right at the beginning of these things. You who have made known to me the ways of life, you will make me full of gladness with your presence. And later he says, foreseeing all these things, David had spoken of the resurrection of the Messiah. This Jesus God raised up, and of that all of us are witnesses. Now, bringing this around, let's think about all of us are witnesses. We learned some things a couple weeks ago in going through preparations for Easter. And I have to say, what would it have been like to have been there at that first Passover? To actually be, you and I, part of that group in that room and experience these kind of strange things. I mean, the disciples were all used to what a Passover meal was like. And they did the things that were normal in that Passover meal. But Jesus added some other little things that surprised them, like washing their feet. That was strange. That was unusual. That was God coming down here to be a servant, even taking off his outer garments. And it was kind of humiliating for him to wash their feet. And he said, if I don't wash you, Peter, you have no part with me. And Peter said, then wash all of me. He said, no. You're not really talking about washing feet. He was talking about being a servant, a really low servant. Okay? Peter experienced that. You know, another thing I learned last week that they experienced, at the end of that service, it says before they went out, they sang a hymn. Can you imagine being there? It's so lovely to be here with all of you, and I can hear you singing. Now, of course, when I say that, you'll say, well, I can't sing. What if you were there at that meal, and it was time to sing this hymn? Even if you couldn't sing, guess what you probably did? You sang. Guess what you also probably did? You heard Jesus sing. Can you imagine Peter now walking away remembering he had heard Jesus sing? Now, why were they singing? I had to look that up. As part of the whole Passover meal thing, they sang several different things. And especially near the end, they sang from the Psalms. Psalm 115 to 118 is a particular section that was sung, parts of that at the end of the meal. And if you go read those Psalms, they're Psalms of victory. Remember, they're celebrating and remembering coming out of Egypt, and they're singing these Psalms of victory. So here's Jesus, knowing what's ahead, knowing that the evil one has taken over Judas, knowing he's about to be betrayed. He not only washed their feet, knowing all of this is happening, he stood up with them at the end and sang a song of victory. I have to think that Jesus was reminding himself and re-cementing himself in his heart as to what this was all about. Reconnecting himself with the Father and the heart of the Father, which was a heart of passionate love for these people. So passionately loving every one of us that he was willing to make this sacrifice, willing to become a human, willing to go through this suffering. Why? Because there was some formula that had to be fulfilled? No. As a demonstration. Remember what Jesus told Nicodemus? For God so loved the world that he sent his son. He sent his son to demonstrate how deeply and how much he loves, how committed he is. I think that says the Father is passionately committed to us and his plan. He is passionately committed. And Jesus, filled with that passion, was committed, sang a song of victory before going out in the garden and suffering in terrible ways, both in that garden and through the next day. What if we'd been there and sung that psalm of victory? We would have been like the other disciples. Our feelings of victory would have evaporated pretty quickly in the garden later. But not for Jesus. Jesus was fully committed. I was struck by something. We were with Tony and Wilma and many others at a funeral this week for Larry O'Masta. Some of you know him, or Dean, you mentioned you were in college with him and this and that and the other, and you even worked in the same department. And Larry was a wonderful guy. And at his funeral, there were some beautiful things said about him. And it's really nice to have known somebody where a lot of people are saying the same very nice things about them, and you agree, and this was wonderful. But something that really struck me. They talked about Larry being committed as a football fan, and that he was a passionate football fan. Okay? And the point was made that when Larry was involved in something, he was all in. And the point went on to say, you know, when it came to Jesus, Larry was all in. And I thought, what a beautiful thing to have people say about you at your funeral. When it came to Jesus, he was all in, was passionate. Well, that just even reflects here how Jesus was all in. All in. And all in because the Father is all in. Conclusion, God is still passionate about what he's doing. Here we are after Easter. Guess what? He's still passionate. Jesus, who sang at that meal, is still singing. He's all in. He's made that victory. Okay? All the details aren't worked out yet, but it's as good as done. And we get to come along with that. So now we say after this, now what? Now after Easter, now what? I think we have an opportunity over the next few weeks especially to sit back and think about all that. Soak that in. Realize how passionate God is, and let that become part of our thinking and part of our focus and part of our daily renewal. And as that soaks in, let God provide, bring, come to us as the Spirit, and give us that new heart so we can go forward, not as the Israelites did, not as the Pharisees did. I mean, they thought they were doing good stuff and they wanted to do good stuff, but they got off the track, just like you and I do every day in some way or other. But we have a new heart and a new motivator and a new comforter to move us forward and allow us to grow in the passion of Jesus. So that not only is Jesus still passionate, but we will be too. Let's pray. Father, remind us of these good things we need to know and of your loving, eternal, and forever commitment. Remind us and help us grow in every day, in passion, in love, in all the attributes of the Spirit, to emulate Christ in his love for others, and to understand more and more how we are known as your disciples because we love one another, because that love comes from you, and that love is unending. Thank you for teaching, delivering, and leading us forward. And we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.